Hi, everyone. My name is Mimi Onuoha. I'm an artist. I am excited that we are all gathered here today. I am mostly moderating this panel that we have, which is composed of three wonderful, wonderful research aides who worked with me on a project that we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. Those three people are Tamilore Ajayve, Michaela Green, Jack Sullivan. I am going to let each of them introduce themselves right now. Oh, and I should say, Mimi Noha, my pronouns are she, her. As I said, I'm an artist. I will pass it to Michaela first.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Michaela Green. I'm a senior at Princeton and I go by she, her pronouns.
Hi everyone, my name is Tamilore JD. I'm a senior at Princeton and I use she, her pronouns.
Hey everybody, my name is Jack Sullivan. I'm also a senior at Princeton and I use he, him pronouns.
And that is our wonderful panel. They're going to talk a little bit more later on, but for now, I'm going to do some framing work and talk about how they got to be working with me and a few other people on a project. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Share this. Cool. Okay, so as I said, it's the three of them who are really the heart of this operation today. But this is a project that I am sort of the lead PI for, and really is only possible because of lots of different people who come on and join us and do a lot of work. So what I'm going to do is start us off with a little bit of an overview of the project, provide some context for how these three students got involved, set some framework for what the project is meant to be doing and others who are working with us. And then I'm going to pass it to them and they're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the work that they did this past summer. Then come back to me, we'll wrap up, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions, which hopefully you can direct towards them and that I can help moderate. So to begin with, the name of this project is Ground Truth. However, it is a project that has switched names a lot. We've been working on it for years. So the research aides might refer to it as just a project on convict labor, convict leasing, or various other names. Don't be too confused. So this project, the point of the project has stayed the same the whole time. And that is that in this project, we are trying to use machine learning to infer the locations of undiscovered, as of yet, mass convict leasing era graves in the US. This is a project that combines original research with art, with computational analysis, and all of it is with the goal of foregrounding the lasting contemporary effects of historical violence in this land. We are going to talk a little bit more about machine learning later on in just a bit, but what I do want to make sure of before we get into that is that we're all on the same page of what convict leasing is. Convict leasing this is a system, for those who don't know, this is a system that took place specifically in the US. It was a forced labor system that emerged directly after the Civil War. 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, and it prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude, but explicitly exempts those who have been convicted of a crime. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, a lot of Black folks were no longer legally enslaved, but there were a lot of some Southern states in particular that created these codes that would essentially allow them to convict Black people on pretty petty, almost non-existent or flimsy charges, and then put them in chains. Keep in mind, this is right after the Civil War, so a lot of these Southern states also did not have large or very robust infrastructure. So what these states would do is rather than put them in these non-existent prisons or prisons that had been destroyed or weren't functioning well, they would then lease these prisoners out to private railways, mines, plantations, and other different kinds of industries. As the definition on the screen from the Equal Justice Initiative shows, states profited from this. Prisoners earned no pay, faced inhumane, dangerous, and often deadly work conditions. And historians have termed this slavery by another name. I want to be clear, this actually was not just slavery by another name, although it certainly evolved from that system. This, I would say, was the latest evolution of an economic and labor system designed to extract wealth and maintain white supremacy at the same time. And it's important to differentiate it too from slavery. Keep in mind, slavery involved a lot of individuals who had enslaved people. This was a system that the states, governments were actually putting on, even while they were acknowledging at the same time that it was inexcusable. So this is the moment in American history when prison population switches from being composed primarily of white people to being composed primarily of Black folks. And there are some really clear connections that we can draw to the current incarceration system that come back to this time. And this system, I will also say, it lasted late 1860s, early 1870s until the 1930s. So it lasted for quite a bit of time, encompassed thousands of people, and is a system that I think is comparative to its impact is not as deeply spoken about in the US. And certainly I would imagine not as much internationally as well. So I learned about convict leasing because a grave showed up in my hometown, or it didn't show up, it was there all along. What happened was that a school was trying to break ground, a school district was trying to break ground for a new school right outside of Houston, which is where I grew up. And what they discovered were these bodies, and these bodies were the bodies from people who had gone through the convict leasing system. What we are trying to do in this project is expand that kind of conversation. For a lot of us who did learn about this, and especially those of us who lived in the town, this was a pretty huge event. And it was one of those events that was so huge because it seemed in some ways like a complete surprise. Who knew that those bodies were there? And yet at the same time, later it became very clear lots of people had been talking about this and they had been suppressed when they had been bringing this up. So in our project, what we are trying to do is expand the conversation so that we're not just talking about this one site in Houston or outside of Houston. We want to use a random forest machine learning model to try to predict other counties in the US where similar graves from convict leasing are likely to be. We know that this can be done because there are members of our team who have been involved in similar work before. What you see on the screen here, this is a screenshot of an article that I wrote back in 2017 when I was working more as a data journalist for courts. And what I wrote about was this work that was being done in Mexico. And this work was the collaboration between 3 different groups. One of those groups was the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Another one was an organization called Data Cívica. And the third was a university, the Universidad Iberoamericana. And all 3 of them were coming together to do this work to see if they could use machine learning to try to uncover mass graves of disappeared people in Mexico, desaparecidos. What they found was that they could. And they were able to do this by bringing all of their different expertise and data sets together. And what they found, the model that they created was able to point out likely equivalents of counties in Mexico where these graves were likely to be. And in fact, that model is still being used by organizers to find their loved ones, disappeared people. HRDAG, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, was a big partner for that project, and they're also a big partner on this project. Patrick Ball, who's the organization's director of research, is the other evergreen member of this small team. The small team that consists mostly of Patrick and I, and then we're just lucky enough to be able to, usually over the summer, bringing more people, research aides, who help us to carry out all of this work. So that previous project was great because it taught us that this, I said us, it was mostly them. I just reported on it. That previous project is still useful because it makes it clear that all of this is possible, even though it also shows that this takes a lot of work. We have on the screen just this little graphic that we make to try to explain what it takes to do all of this. It requires collecting lots of different data sets. We have to collect our dependent and our predictor, try to figure out, it's not like there's a data set that already exists around this, so we have to do a lot of work to put together all the data that we need, and then we have to get that in the right form. We've got to train a model using it. We've got to test that model, refine. Eventually, we end up with this list of counties. This chart makes everything sound very neat, very orderly. It is, of course, not like this. We're constantly jumping between these steps so that you're collecting data, and then you're cleaning it while you're also collecting more, and then you start training, but then you realize you need more data, and then you are trying to go back, figure out what you can use, what state it's in. It's obviously a much, much messier project. I think the research aides who talk will allude to that a little bit. And as you can imagine, this is also a project that just brushes up against a ton of different topics. We could really be here all day talking about all of those topics. So there's the question of what it means to do work today about the past and about particularly violent past. There's our motivation in doing this work. We are creating this model. It will be mathematically sound, but it is still conceptually very challenging for a number of reasons that I won't get into right now, but that we can have time to talk about a little bit later. There's this question, which is for us really one of the center of the project, which is why it is that this machine learning model can be seen as a source of evidence that's more reliable than the stories we have from people who live in these areas and know about these pasts. I know this firsthand, having grown up in such a place where there were people who were talking about this, but as I said, their voices really were suppressed and quieted. And it's only very recently that there's this wider movement of folks who are trying to make sense of these kind of histories. But we could talk about all of those things all day. That's not what I want. That's not the question that I want us to really think about today, and that I want everything to center around today. Even though those issues are deeply interesting and they're a core part of the project, I want to narrow our focus today to a seemingly technical question that's actually anything but that. And this is a question that seems banal on the surface, but it is really at the heart of the project. And that is this, which is, what do we think that data tells us about the world? What does it mean to use data as a tool for making sense of the world? When I say this, I'm not using this like vague we that a lot of people use. You know, you'll sometimes hear questions, someone says, how do we X, Y, Z? I am not being vague. When I say we, I'm talking directly about those of us who are working on this project. And I'm talking about any of you who are working on similar projects or are interested in results of work like this. Patrick and I are an artist. I'm an artist, Patrick is a statistician, and the folks that we have worked with have spanned a lot of different groups. We've worked with lots of students, we've worked with elders, we've worked with community members. What we have found is that all of us are asking similar questions, even though those questions come from different places. And these are questions about the veracity of knowledge. It's about what it means to do work around the past. So when I say this, what do we think that data tells us about the world? There are really a ton of other questions that are wrapped up in it. Things about how do we know things about the past? How do we deal with archives, which are these spaces where decisions have been made about what gets kept and what is lost? How do we confront unknowability? How do we confront that uncertainty? How do we know how we trust our tools? What are the limits of these tools? And how do we hold those limits? What does that look like? And I say these, again, these are not theoretical questions. These are active questions. They are real things that we have to consider and encounter and deal with as we are working. We're creating this model that can predict the likelihood that a county in the US has graves from the practice of convict leasing. As I've said, we've had to gather that data ourselves. We don't have a clear data set that tells us the counties in the US that did or did not, or may have had convict leasing. We've had to look at primary and secondary sources to determine this. And we've had to make lots of different decisions constantly because the world doesn't fit these forms perfectly. We have to grapple with the very framework that we have. And all of that is to say that this is a project that is about working with absence and uncertainty, not in spite of them. It's a project where we're not treating those things as incidental or annoying. We are really holding them at the center of all the work that we're doing. And I mean that, again, not in a theoretical sense, in a very practical, on the ground sense. For instance, and the students know this. I'll give two examples that they're going to talk more about. We have one of the industries that most employed, I said employed, they were not employed, but the industries that most used forced convict labor was the railroad industry. That is an industry that is very difficult for us to track and make sense of because of the way that the workers on it are constantly moving around. There's this uncertainty that's at the heart of it, but we have to do something with that uncertainty. We have to pin it down, we have to frame it, we have to make it a little bit more tangible. Another example of this is that in order to create a model about where undiscovered mass graves are, we have to know places where those graves do not exist. Our model needs to be able to distinguish and tell difference. And so that absence, knowing very certifiably counties that did not have graves, these mass graves, and particularly counties that did not have mass graves that might have been close to counties that did, helps us make sense of the pattern of violence and the reasons for why different labor was used in different places. So we have to know these things well enough to be able to even do a project like this. And it is both a statistical and mathematical way of thinking about uncertainty, but there's like a very real life level to this as well. So that's why I wanted to ground everything in this question. What do we think that data tells us about the world? And I am excited now with this that I am going to pass things over to our research aides very soon. I think that the work that they've been doing has been sitting in this place. And they are going to talk about things in a much different way than me. They're going to talk about it more specifically, the work they did over the past summer. They're going to talk about it in a kind of on the ground way, again, very concrete. But for me, when I think about the work that they were doing, really what Patrick and I did was we threw them right into this question. We threw them right into the middle of all of the absence and uncertainty that we were dealing with. And we said, make sense of it, bring us back something that we can use. And as a result, for some of them, it means that they would start in one place and end up finding all of these different things that would then become the heart of their project, or that they would have to like work on something and then take another approach. They dealt with that fantastically. They dealt with it swimmingly. They did a wonderful job. That's why I highly recommend them if you're looking for people to work with you and you want to hire. I don't know. They have other things going on, but I am going to pass it over to them. What I want to do before I pass it over to them is just provide one tiny additional bit of context. For the summer of 2021, we partnered with Princeton University's Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. We worked with them to do the summer project. From that, these 3 undergraduate students were, I think y'all were assigned to our project. I like to think that you picked it, but they ended up working with us. And something that I do want to highlight about them that very much stands out is that these are students who understand, have a grasp of the technical work that we were doing, but who also deeply understand the history of the US and the economic and social structures that affect the kind of work that we're doing as well. We gave them a number of concrete tasks. They had challenges that they encountered. And I am now, with that, going to pass things over to the 3 of them. Let me stop sharing my screen. And y'all can take it away.
Great. Me and Michaela and Tammy Lore had the privilege of working with Mimi, who's on the call, as well as Patrick Ball of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group over the summer of 2021, as Mimi said, on this project. And we were working through the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab at Princeton, which is a lab under the direction of Professor Ruha Benjamin, housed in Princeton's African American Studies Department. And just as a little bit of context, the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab seeks to bring together students, educators, activists, and artists to develop a critical and creative approach to data conception, production, and circulation. And its aims are to rethink and retool the relationship between stories and statistics, power and technology, and data and justice. And so our cohort of summer research associates worked with a whole bunch of different community organizations. Obviously, the 3 of us were partnered with Mimi and Patrick on this ground truth project. But projects ranged from investigating policing and surveillance in New York City public housing, partnering with the Fair Food Alliance, which works with farmers' rights and fair pay for farm workers in Florida, and work with Professor Ruha Benjamin, who runs the lab, on her own work, looking into abolitionist community organizations and investigating the work that they're doing in communities. So our work on this project focused on 2 main goals. That was tracking railroad construction during the Reconstruction era, and also finding null data about places where convict leasing did not occur in order to train our machine learning model, in order to find, or more accurately be able to identify where convict leasing did or did not occur. And so during this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about our plans and goals for the summer, the different projects we worked on within those sort of 2 main goals, and different highs and lows and what we took away learning from this project. So I will pass it over to Tammy Lore, who's going to tell us a little bit more about work with railroad construction and figuring out where railroads were being built and using convict labor.
Hello, everyone. So this summer, our project was focused on finding railroads and the counties that they were being built in. The reason that we want to have a project specifically focused on discovering railroads is because we want to create a data set by the end that showcases railroad on a county specific level. The hope was that having a data set with as many railroads identified would make it easier to find sites of mass graves and convict leasing, and also deeper into the conversation about convict leasing and mass graves. To do this, Jack and I divided this project into two main focuses: data visualization and data collection. On my end, I focus more on data collection, while Jack focused on data visualization, and he'll talk about that during his section later on. So on my end, I found data collection and scavenged numerous books and articles about railroads and convict labor, while Jack looked at mapping. I spent the majority of the time collecting and looking at maps to find a history. To help incoming researchers understand the areas and history of the railroads collected, the categories that I sought out were history of railroad formation, counties constructed, dates that railroads started and ended constructing, if convict leasing explicitly occurred at these railroads, and finally, citation. By the end of the summer, a data set with over 70 railroads were created. This was done by looking through numerous books on railroads, government sites, and other researchers' publications on railroads during the 19th centuries. As seen in the pictures, this data set included county codes to standardize it with other counties and other data sets, a binary code to indicate whether convict leasing occurred, the company or person that owned/chartered the railroad at that time, and a source link citation to validate and be able to go over the information after my time in internship ended. Although many states had railroads built around this time, I found that southern states were shown to have the most railroads built with convict leasing, more specifically in states of Alabama and Georgia. States such as Tennessee and Florida also had a couple of recorded instances where convict leasing was being used as well. Northern states had railroads being created during this time, but the vast majority of these railroads did not have convict leasing occurring. Some difficulties that I had while collecting data was a change of names. Numerous sites recorded railroads differently than their actual names, or used railroads and railways interchangeably. Having to decipher multiple names for the same place proved to be challenging at times. And for these instances, I just normally put a side note in the same row so that other researchers were aware that there's another name that goes by. One thing that our community partners, Mimi and Patrick, have been enforcing into us during the summer was to make sure that our data could be read even when we're not there, which is why I try to put as many details about the railroads as possible, including citations and where the railroad information was obtained, as well as different name changes. Thank you. Now I'll pass it back to Jack.
Yeah, so as Tammy Laurie mentioned, my main goal in the railroad part of the project was figuring out where railroads were constructed by looking at railroad maps. And so the way I did that was by collecting a bunch of different railroad maps from the time period, roughly ranging from 1870 to 1925. As that was sort of the height of convict leasing in the South. And I scoured through a bunch of different libraries, archives, and the like to find maps of where railroads were constructed, or rather maps of railroads, and then looking at comparisons between the maps to figure out where were new railroads built over time. And so, the reason we focused on railroads, Mimi touched on this a little bit, was that some of the biggest lessees of convict labor were railroads, as the South, as it was industrializing, required greater infrastructure to build up a more modern economy in the post-slavery era. And so convict labor was leased out to railroads in order to build that necessary infrastructure and build up the Southern economy during this time period. And once I had sort of obtained a lot of these maps from archives and the like, my work then turned to sort of turning those maps into data. And the way that I did that was through, at first I did it by hand, was looking at maps and seeing where railroads were being built by just comparing side by side and seeing which counties given that sort of the county level is what we've broken down into to identify where convict leasing had occurred, looking at which counties had gained railroads or lost railroads through comparisons of maps. But I found that that was a pretty inefficient way to do things. And so I then turned to using QGIS and sort of mapping software in order to figure out or to more accurately map where railroads were being built. And so on the right side of this slide, you see a map of all the railroads in the United States, or at least all the known railroads in the United States in 1870, and highlighted in pink, or the railroads are in green lines, and then highlighted in pink are every county that had railroads in 1870. And so the goal was to sort of create something like this in different time intervals to determine where railroads were being constructed during this time period. And it was certainly challenging in that historical maps are not always accurate to the satellite maps that are used in software like QGIS. And so I had some trouble sort of matching up county lines and railroad lines with their actual locations and things like that. Not to mention the fact that county lines have changed in some states since 150 years ago. But nonetheless, it was certainly fruitful work in finding and locating this data and helping it to feed the machine learning model with it. And of course, we as a group and myself enjoyed learning a whole lot from Mimi and Patrick, both about machine learning and data science, as well as about convict leasing and the different work and investigation that they had done into it. So now I'll pass it over to Michaela to hear a bit more about how looking for null data points and the absence of convict leasing played into our work over the summer.
Yeah. So this summer, as you can see, most of our work was surrounded around the first step of this project, collecting data sets. So from this graphic that Mimi kind of already previewed to, you can see that one of the dependent variables for the model is counties that are known not to have mass graves as a result of convict leasing. And the importance of knowing this is kind of more better explained in steps 3 and 4 of the project though. Okay. So first, the model is trained to sort through combinations of variables to basically determine the relationships that will make a place more or less likely to have mass graves. You can go to the next one. And then the model is tested on confirmed data to see how accurately it predicts what we already know. And so the absence of convict leasing was essentially an important variable for the model to be able to predict well, and for the model to be able to discern between which countries that do have convict leasing and those that don't, based on data that we already had. So this test was really flexible because there was not a set direction that we had to begin. But this is what also made it difficult because there is limited research on what's not present or the absence of things. So like after the first team meeting, Jack and I came up with like a list of ideas that we thought could lead us to counties with an absence of convict leasing. And so one of the ideas that we really used throughout the summer was looking at places with large Black ownership, land ownership. And we made some assumptions here because one, we thought that convict leasing wouldn't take place in areas of Black land ownership or just places with large Black populations because it was a white power structure. And also because, especially like post-slavery, land ownership symbolized freedom for Black people. So the very opposite of convict leasing. So from there, I worked on finding data on Black farms and Black land ownership. So for this project, I found almost 25 data sets centered around farm data, land ownership, household data, and pushed them into the repo for the project. And on the left is an example of one of the data sets I found using Princeton Social Explorer tool, which is just a census data tool that allowed me to select the specific variables I wanted in the years and create data tables from them. This data set is in the country state format and it has information about the number of farms owned by white and Black people in 1910. None of the data I found, though, specifically focused on Black land ownership. Um, so even though much of the census data that does, even much of the census data that does not have much information on Black farms before 1900 also. So basically, since I couldn't find like a comprehensive data set, I began to create one for Black land ownership using secondary sources. I read through newspaper articles, journal articles, and books to pick out details of Black land ownership or settlement. And while some census data goes as deep as the county level, this data set goes a little deeper as it lists specific farms, communities, or towns within these counties where Black people bought land and settled. In some cases, I found areas where Black people established towns or even places where the government provided farms. Yeah. So Jack even actually added information about certain railroads that may have passed through these towns. So towards the end of the project, Mimi kind of pushed us to think about like how we could use our research beyond the project. And I think that for me, finding that I couldn't find a comprehensive data set on Black land ownership, that it would be beneficial for a number of projects. So I uploaded this data set to GitHub for public use so that hopefully people can add to it and use it for other research purposes.
Yeah, so thank you all for listening and hearing a bit about our work. We're excited to hear your questions. And certainly it was a privilege to work with Mimi and Patrick this past summer on this project, and to get to reconvene here and share it with you all.
Great. Thank y'all so much. It's funny. I was there while you were doing this, but it is so wonderful to see you go through and talk about the specific work you did. I was like, oh my gosh, yes, that's true. You did do all of that. We have a lot of questions that have come in. I encourage y'all, please do keep sending them. We're going to use the rest of this time, the next 30 minutes, to talk about some of these questions. I'm actually the moderator, so I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask my own question first. But I do see the questions everyone is sending. As I said, continue to send those. And I wanted to ask the three of you, I have a couple questions. I'm going to just start with one. Something I do want to highlight is, Patrick and I talk about this a lot. It's not just the work we're doing, but also the way we do the work that we like to think about and consider. And all of you were working remotely. We're working around this it's a very violent project. We have never met in person. I don't know how tall you are. I don't know. We've never done that. We don't know. And I am curious what you thought were some of the advantages and disadvantages of working on a project like this remotely.
Yeah, I think one advantage is just being able to work at our own paces. And throughout the summer, as rising college seniors, we had all kinds of different things going on. I know Tammy, Lori, and Michaela both had other internships they were working at. I myself spent some time traveling throughout the summer and was able to take the work with me, which was certainly a blessing to be able to do both of those things at the same time. And yeah, I feel like those were some of the big advantages of it. I would say maybe some disadvantages would be, our ability to, collaborate and really share work together is limited when you have to, schedule meetings in digital spaces in order to do that. But nonetheless, I feel like our weekly meetings that we did have were good for sort of establishing goals and sharing the kind of work that we had been doing each week.
I can go too. Like Jack said, the biggest probably advantage was the flexibility. Like we had like code review sessions, and they also got to be recorded so we could look back and watch them. But I guess also, like Jack said, one of the disadvantages was building the same type of relationship you would if you were in person, like being able to do some work on the computer and then go over and say, hey, Tammy, like, what are you doing? Or like, I need some help. We had to go on Zoom, and then Zoom fatigue also for the disadvantage.
Yeah, just echoing off what Jack and Michaela said. Definitely flexibility was the biggest advantage. I think being able to work on it anytime really helped like my schedule, especially in the summer. you can like, oh, okay, I'll come back to this and actually be able to come back because there's no like, oh, you're gonna see them in person next time at 8 a.m. So it needs to be done by 8 a.m. So that was really good. But I think also similar to what Michaela and Jack said, the disadvantage is really not being able to see people and also not being able to like talk about it in person. I don't know. For me, I think also our schedules were so different and we were all on different timelines. Even though we were on the same time zone, we were not on the same time zone. So it was very hard making the same like meetings and even like appointments that we had scheduled. Things will happen, things will come around. It'll be harder to like make those. Whereas like in person, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. So you know you're gonna meet at this time each day, face to face. So there's like a higher like standard for just meetings. Everything else was great.
Yeah, thank y'all. I think it is really useful to ask and think and talk about because it becomes there's working on projects like this, y'all know, it is just about violence. But then when you're on your own working on it, it kind of just becomes about data. And you like that kind of back and forth, which I think is an important tension to hold. There is something about this remote way of working that toys with that. Okay, there are a lot of questions that have come in about the project. So I'm gonna ask them. I think some of them, I'm gonna try to get y'all to weigh in on them. Some of them, I don't know if you'll be able to, and I might have to. So don't feel bad about that. But this first one, Michaela, I think this is mostly addressed to you. But the other, I mean, Jack and Tommy, if y'all have like ideas on it, you also can weigh in. So it is about how else the Black land ownership data set could be used. This person says it sounds like it could be incredibly valuable. And I wonder if you have any things that you have thought about, any ways you think it could be used.
Yeah. I guess another way it can be used is to just track maybe like where people went post slavery, just thinking about in general where people decided to settle and what that means, and just checking, I guess, the history of how counties have developed over time, because a lot of Black history is erased from the past. And so if we know where Black people were and settled before and how that has changed over time, I guess we'd be able to understand better like the relationships that the lives that they created for themselves post slavery.
Great, thank you. The other two, y'all have anything you want to weigh in on? You don't have to. Great. Okay. Someone has asked, do you envision your algorithm or this model being applied to Indigenous residential school graves, famine graves, and other institutional mass graves? If yes, how so? And I want to put this to y'all because you working on this, y'all worked on this tiny little bit just for the summer, and you saw what it took and how we are still trying to gather everything to be able to do this. And so I am curious what you think in terms of what it could look like if you think we could apply the same thing to other spaces, and or what it would require, places you think might be more primed for it.
Yeah, especially when like you talked about Indigenous, I was like, oh, that's such a great idea, especially because so much like Black history is been intentionally erased. I would think that the biggest thing is like there has to be more resources. It can't just be a small group of 5 people doing all the work. Because I honestly think that if like numerous of like hundreds of people came together, because Indigenous people have their own way of storytelling, data keeping, record keeping that we may not understand. So they were also to help us understand it, and putting this in like a big data set will help. But I think it also has to do with the United States actually like acknowledging the pain that they've caused these communities. So I think this data set could be used as a way for the United States to kind of like stop being like, oh, we haven't done anything, and be like, oh yes, we have done these things. So I think it'd be a great idea. I just think there needs to be more resources for us to do that.
Yeah, I'd also add, like, as far as direct applications, like, I think the example of, Native American boarding schools, it would be like one that could be really applicable, given that mass graves have been found in multiple instances, and that, it's a much more trackable thing than, the many different industries that leased convict labor in the South, as opposed to, a handful of schools that forcibly enrolled Native American children, and oftentimes killed and murdered them. And so in that sense, I think examples like that you can sort of pinpoint more directly, their sources or causes could also be sort of I guess simpler applications of this sort of model that could be really effective.
Yeah, it is. Thank you both. I I agree, and also, I think about the Desaparecidos example, the Mexico one we did. That one was it's similar in some ways, but one of the huge differences is that it is a thing that's happening right now. And so there is a lot more data collection today. And as a result, the team working on that, they had more that they could use. Us doing these historical things, y'all know because you encountered it, there's just not the same fidelity of record keeping. Tommy, Lauren, Jackie, both of you have touched on this. It is different having access. Basically, we are very much tied to what we can collect and what we can like pull from the archives. And it's a good tension because sometimes the things we can't collect are things that were erased. The very reason we can't collect it is the reason why we're doing the project. So there are these difficulties. Y'all know we were deep in it. So it's the kind of thing where there are ways in which I agree with you. I could imagine, I think it would be wonderful to consider this somewhere else, like for Indigenous folks to do their own version of something like this. It can't be like copy and paste. It's impossible, but it's still, that doesn't mean that the idea for it is not a useful one. Okay, somebody is asking if this project will focus on states like Alabama and Georgia in the first iteration, or if it will span wherever railroads are, especially across the South. That is not, I have an answer to that. The answer for me, really what we've been, but actually, before I give my answer, what I will do is ask y'all who were working, y'all were working on this all summer, and especially railroad crew, were there certain states that you found it easier to get this data from, or you found it like there was more, it was easier to track these, or there were more railroads around? I can't remember, were there certain states that showed up a lot more?
Yeah, like states like Alabama and Georgia, which already I think has a history of convict leasing. Like I found that there were like chapters on like railroads in Alabama and Georgia. I think there's also a book, I think you may have given it, that actually talked about convict leasing explicitly in Alabama. I think one state like actually had the history of railroads and they talked about it. So yeah, I think some states, but I think like the southern, more south you went, like states like Florida, even Texas for a little bit, some kind of, not really, but a little bit. And like, but I think northern states, there wasn't like as much information about like that. It was more like, oh, these railroads were built. So I think there was like two things happening at once. Railroads were being built, but also like who was actually building the railroads. And there's that lack of acknowledgement for some states.
Yeah, I mean, convict leasing is a practice that certainly wasn't limited to the South. It's something that happened all the way up in like Montana or Minnesota, and it's something that, to a degree, still happens today, although they're like paid. And it was certainly more prevalent in the South, and so that was what we were sort of focusing on and trying to track, especially in its most brutal aspects. And as far as looking at railroad construction, I sort of focused on the South in trying to find maps, just knowing that was sort of the main area where the most brutal convict labor that would have been, killing workers and creating mass graves sort of along these railroad routes was going to be occurring. And so I guess sort of a feedback loop of sorts, what was created there in terms of looking at the South most intensely and therefore finding the most about the South.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I'm gonna jump on what you said, Jack. Just point out, even today, the states where inmates are not paid or paid the least, or really, especially not paid very much, are states that had convict leasing. There's a clear pattern that you can tie back to this. And we mentioned, y'all worked with us over the summer since now we're in February, so we've had some changes on the projects that I haven't even updated you on. So you're finding out live with everyone else. The state that we have started with, that we have now like put a lot of our attention on, is Texas, actually. And the reason for that is, you won't be surprised when I say it, we have the most, in Texas, are the most counties that we know did not have convict leasing. We have a whole list for Texas in a way that we don't have for a lot of the other states. And as a result, it means that we are putting a lot of our attention on Texas first, but still building the rectangle. Y'all know there's like a whole rectangle that we start with to make sense of everything. We are still doing it for all of them, but we are like focusing a little bit more on Texas right now because we think it'll just be a little bit, the results will just be more useful at this stage. But again, it's just because of we follow the limits of the data, we follow the limits, we follow the absences. So that's where we've been going. However, as y'all pointed out, certain states in every other way, in terms of talking about convict leasing, y'all already mentioned it. Alabama comes up constantly, like this is everywhere, but certain states, Florida, Georgia, like you hear a little bit more, Louisiana. The strange thing, the kind of paradoxical thing is, because you hear so much about where it is, you don't hear as much about where it's not. And that's the thing that we're still chasing and we're still trying to look for. I want to interject with one of my own questions for the three of you. I'm curious how working on this project, where you have had to really, I think you had to really very closely interrogate data sets. Some of you all of you were creating your own based on these things you were working with. How has this changed how you approach and think about data? Or has it?
I think for me, having to think about where the data was coming from, sometimes I never really thought up beforehand. And I think I always took for granted the fact that the data was always available, and I would look into how data was collected. And even now, I have to do a thesis and having to incorporate data, actually thinking about the value of where the data came from, especially making your own data set, and also how it was the methodology of it. I think that's actually a very important thing now. I think having to see, okay, why did you choose these factors? Why did you choose age? One of the things I had to decide for mine, what counts as low income, middle income, high income, why these factors for things like this? Because even having to figure out what considers convict leasing, because everyone had people had definitions, or they didn't have definitions, but it happened. So why these definitions? So I think that's something I've actually kind of started thinking about more and more. Why do we do something this way, this way, this way? And how is this useful? Is this pertinent? Is this helping me? Is this not helping me? So I think that's what I've really taken from this.
Yeah, I actually think having to think so much about what the data that's not available actually informed a lot of my senior thesis now, and thinking about, because my senior thesis is basically surrounded around public opinion polls and how they, I guess, portray attitudes towards police abolition, and the types of questions they ask and the type of headlines they use. So just thinking about the type of question that they don't ask has forced me to ask about, well, what is missing? What questions aren't they asking that are not getting the whole picture? So a lot of my work centers around that. And I think in creating the Black land ownership data set, it also made me think about, well, what data is based on kind of what we value. So why don't we value these things? What story are we trying to create? What history are we trying to erase?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly, I'm a history student here at Princeton. And so much of what we do as historians is focused on what is recorded, and making do with what we can from what's been recorded, trying to figure things out. And so, just the consideration of what gets recorded and what is assigned that sort of value of being kept and being tracked in terms of data is something that I hadn't really considered or even thought about, just because it's so essential to history that you just have things that are recorded, and so much relies on that. And so, I think that sort of reconsideration and reframing of thinking about everything I look at as a historian, even as I'm doing my own research for a senior thesis here at Princeton, is certainly a big reframing that I gained from this project.
Great. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for that. All of that is really insightful. I feel like each of you just highlighted the things that Patrick and I are always like, these are some of these key points, and each of you just like hit it on the head. I mean, we did all work together for a while, so perhaps it's not as surprising, but I completely agree with you. I think that this question of how any data set was collected is just so incredibly important. And so, you show it's not contained. Y'all show us the data sets that you collected, the maps that you made, and that process is not there. You can't see it until you explain it to us. So it is removed from that artifact, but it is just completely essential to understanding it. And I just really just commend how deeply y'all went into that process of understanding that. All right, we have more questions. Somebody asked, this one I'll just answer real quick. They said, how's mass grave defined in the project? We just say 2 or more. That's it. It's not, I should have said that earlier. And then somebody asked about railroad workers constantly moving around and if the bodies would actually be spread out. And the answer is yes. And that's the problem. That's the hard part. But this one I'm gonna put to y'all. Somebody said, a very serious and sobering topic. I commend you all for working to uncover these atrocities and to bring information and closure to families. It's a fantastic application of AI, an example of AI for good. I'm curious about the AI model specifics of the project and current status on findings relative to convict leasing and grave sites discovered. Also, what was the ethnic distribution of the convict leasing programs? So to the 3 of you, I'm going to put this last question about, I don't know, did y'all encounter anything about this ethnic distribution? I can't remember if you, and it's okay if you're like, no, I didn't at all. Did any of you in your research see anything that would challenge the idea that actually we know it was mostly Black people. We know that. But did you see anything that would challenge that?
I would say that, largely, numbers I've seen are like 90+% that convict lessees or laborers were Black. Of course, there were white prisoners also leased out under the system. But I would say, honestly, the more sort of shocking or surprising part of it is the amount of women and children who were leased out as convict laborers and subjected to the brutal working conditions of it. And I feel like that dimension, really sort of put into perspective, like how sort of all-encompassing the system of just like labeling people criminals and then turning them into free laborers really was in the South.
And do the 2 of you have anything? Again, totally fine if you don't. Yeah, great. I was going to say the same. Jackie said exactly what I was going to say too. There's a really wonderful book. Oh my gosh, what's the name of it? Do y'all remember? The book about, there's this great book about women in convict leasing in Florida by, I cannot remember. I can't remember.
I believe it's Chained in Silence by DeFloria. Is that right?
Yeah. I think so. I think that's it, right? It's great. It's great. And it really does explode this, like, look, actually lots of women were caught up in this too. That is really the interesting thing. Also, we didn't talk about it as much over the summer, but California is a state that had convict leasing, but it emerged from a different kind of tradition. And in California's system, historically, it was like indigenous folks were wrapped up in this too. And then there are like Latinx folks who come up in it, but really still heavily focused on Black people who live in a white supremacist society. That is often the case. However, another thing that is kind of interesting, somebody brought up indigeneity earlier, and I will also say that there are these kind of patterns of violence that you see in terms of violence that happened to indigenous people and then convict leasing on top of it. So all of these things are linked. Okay, we are coming to the last, Chained in Silence. Yep, that's it, thank you. we're coming to the last 6 minutes or so. And so I want to make sure that each of you kind of gets a chance to say something as we begin to wrap up. And let me make sure, I'll say really quickly, somebody asked about the status of the project. We are using a random forest model. It's a classification algorithm, consists of a lot of trees. It's really great. For our small data set, it's very robust. So that's what we're using. Hopefully we will have updates more on that in the future. And someone else asked about the current status on the findings. I don't really know how to answer that. There's a lot to, we're just still working on it. I'm sorry, I don't have a more specific answer for that. We'll probably be presenting more things in the months to come. And I think, we're actually sharing a blog post that says a little bit more about the project. So people who are interested should look out for that on Mozilla's site. And for the three of you, curious about your future plans that have to do with this topic, this kind of intersection of justice and data, or of machine learning and historical reckoning, or whatever it is you want to say. And that can be in the form of, I know each of you gotta do this thesis. So what you're focusing on your thesis, or if you have plans for the summer or the future, or something you're working on now, just what is on the horizon for you that or even if it's just ideas you're thinking about or grappling with. What's on the horizon? What are you thinking that connects to this work?
Yes, so I am actually a part of Princeton's teacher preparation program. So I'm seeking teaching certification for high school social studies. And actually, as a part of that, I got to sort of do a little continuation of the work of this project by teaching a lesson in an 8th grade history class on convict leasing and sort of the different dimensions of the system. And so I thought that was a unique way that I sort of got to continue this work in my own work, and certainly, as a future teacher of history, talking about untold stories and talking about things that are so often glossed over in the history narratives that we get in sort of dominant written history narratives is really, really important. And that's why I want to become a teacher. That's why I want to teach history well. And certainly this project was a big part of sort of framing that mindset as I go into teaching in the future, and as I student teach right now here in New Jersey.
Okay. Yeah, so this summer I'm actually going to continue to work with Patrick Ball with the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. So possibly I might be able to continue with Mimi's project, or I might work with Patrick on his Guatemala project that he's working on, or I might even be able to work through the Invincible Institute with them, which is like a Chicago organization that works to uncover complaints that the police have covered up. Just continuing, basically, kind of sharpening my data skills, learning more technical skills, but also still working with projects that center justice.
Yeah, so what am I doing? My thesis, I'm using a lot of machine learning just to figure out, like, my thesis is basically looking as to why, even though there's been more policies allowing Black students to go into STEM, there's been a decrease of Black STEM. So looking into that big picture and looking into why, like, policies is not just the only situation. There has to be an internal look into, like, changing things too. So looking into machine learning that actually helped me kind of prove my point. And then, like, after college and beyond, I want to, like, go into, like, doing data analysis and government policy or education policy, something in the intersection of that. I'm taking a break from school because school's a lot, but that's what I want to do.
Thanks, y'all. And thank you for showing us all of this field is so wide. There are so many different places and ways you can take it. Thank you for showing that to us and demonstrating that. And thank you for taking time. It's not easy being a student. Thank you for taking time and actually participating in this panel. Also want to thank everybody who asked questions. If we didn't get to it, I'm sorry. You're welcome to try to follow up with me and I will do my best. We had some other interesting points that were linking different types of Asian labor as well, tied to some of these railroads. There are a lot of things that came up that we couldn't touch on, but really appreciate all of you who were here. And of course, thank you to Mozilla and MozFest for allowing all of us to be here. This has been great. Okay, enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you, everyone.
Listening.